Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll get started. No doubt a few people will be running in, but there's plenty of spare seats, that's okay. Thank you for coming to this masterclass with Dr. Yolanda Moses. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting here today on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be, and I pay my respect to the elders past, present and future. Also remind us that this has always been a place of learning, in different ways, different knowledges, but it's always been a place of learning. It's my great joy to be able to introduce Dr. Yolanda Moses, Professor. She is, of course, our Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Cultural Competence and has been with us at the National Centre for Cultural Competence for most of this year. And it's been an absolute delight having Yolanda here and her vast wealth of experience. She told me to keep it short, which is good because there's about 3 pages I could actually talk about. But just to note that she's a professor of anthropology. She's from the University of California Riverside. She's the Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity and Excellence at the University of California. She explores gender, class disparities in the Caribbean, East Africa and the United States. And of course now she can add Australia to her repertoire. And she's been looking at how this university is implementing cultural competence from a whole of university approach and comparing it to similar activities in America, which is probably what she's going to be talking about, so I won't talk too much about that. So Yolanda, welcome. Thank you very much for sharing this time with us, and over to you.
Thank you all for being here today. I'd like to also give my acknowledgement, and I learned so much being here about the Aboriginal people who lived here before there was anyone else here and lived here for a long time, and this site particularly. So I want to honor the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and also recognize this as a site of education and learning and meeting for eons. And that's very powerful for me, coming from the US, where this is not a tradition that we have in our universities for our First Nations people. Anyway, I'm happy to be here, and I am very happy that I've been so welcomed by the Center for Cultural Competence. And one of the great things about being the first Fulbright Distinguished Chair in a situation like this is that there is nobody before me. So I don't have anybody else's expectations to live up to, so I have to create a few of my own, right? So other people coming can do that. But I'm very happy because it gives me the opportunity to look holistically, and what we're going to be doing is flying at 40,000 feet. If you want to see a more issue-oriented kind of presentation, that will be the one that I give on Friday, where I'm looking at the impact of the Trump administration on this work that we're trying to do in the United States. And it really is having an impact. But what I want to do today is to talk about how we see diversity in the US, how I came to know that I needed to come here because you all are trying to do something different than we're doing in the US, and to make a comparison of those 2 kinds of models to see what does it look like when an institution embraces this notion and not just a program or programs across institutions, which is what we see happening in the US. So the overview of the presentation is looking at this at the national level, in the US particularly, and looking at the reframing of diversity for the 21st century, both here and in the US, the leadership case for diversity and how we define leadership in a system like this, and then looking specifically at things we're doing in both places, because I want to be able to talk about that when I go back, but to also talk about how There's similarities and differences. One of the questions I got, people sent questions in advance, was, can you actually compare universities cross-culturally? And you can't, not line for line, but there are some processes that you can try to understand. And so that's the purpose of this work. I touched it, Mike. Is that a bad thing? All right. Okay. So I'd like to just say that this notion of diversity has been something that we've looked at in the U.S. for at least 40 years. And there was another question I got as to whether or not this was a political process, if this was something that that we need to understand in a political way. And I would say, absolutely it's political. It's always been political. It's just that we didn't call it politics or political. As a matter of fact, 40 years ago, when we first started on this journey, at least I did, we didn't use the term diversity. We used the term multicultural. And then multicultural got a bad name, depending on the political administrations, and so we shifted to something that was more inclusive, and that's diversity. So diversity has come to mean all kinds of things to all kinds of people in the context of the United States. So there are multiple lenses through which we've looked at diversity, and I just want to go through these because when we talk about pushback and we talk about people who are trying to change systems, not just one institution, these are the national conversations that we've had around diversity. The first is that diversity is a demographic imperative. And there is a book that I'm going to circulate here called Brown is the New White. And that's meaningful because part of the vitriol and the pushback we're getting in the US is that the demographics are shifting to the point where those people that used to be called minorities in the US will become the majority population. And so it has implications for how things are done in terms of elections and polling practices and all kinds of pushback from those communities, those states where they don't want to see those changes. The reality is it happened in California 10 years ago. So it's already there. And there were a lot of ups and downs, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but we're still standing. So the second one was diversity as a competitive advantage. That's the business case, and you all know that because you've seen that. Diversity as a national security issue. This happened after 9/11 in the United States. So it's not that there's necessarily a value for understanding cultures and including people who've been excluded. It's a matter of how do we protect ourselves from those people who want to come and hurt us. So creating homeland security, having more people that speak Arabic and more people who are studying terrorism to other people from certain parts of the world has also been an imperative. And then the social justice issue. This went underground in the 80s under the Reagan administration and slowly coming back as something you can talk about. That was not anything you could talk about because that's when the US became a color-blind nation. There's no racial injustice anymore, so you couldn't use those words and talk about diversity in those ways. So social justice is now back on the agenda. Under the Obama administration, he put money, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on Friday, but he put money into the Office of Civil Rights so that they could start investigating the sexual harassment cases that have been building up over the decades and the racial harassment cases that have been built up over the decade. Under the Republican administration, there have been no funds to look at all those cases. So social justice is back on the agenda. Diversity as a democracy issue. As we think about the U.S. as a pluralistic place, democracy is something we say we pride ourselves in. One of the places where this is still a conversation that is had is in our colleges and universities, not as much any place else. And the American Association of Universities and Colleges, the National Association for students who are interested in traveling overseas, and Fulbright Commission all push this notion of democracy and diversity going hand in hand. That is, you can't have a pluralistic democracy unless you have people who are educated around diversity and inclusion issues. The past 10 years has seen the definition of diversity as an educational excellence issue. When I first started in my job about 10 years ago, within my university, which is the University of California, there was a narrative that in an elite research university, diversity was over here and excellence was over here. That is, those two things did not meet. And we have come on a journey, our university system has, and so now it's not just the universities like California that have a lot of diversity in the demographics of the state, but also national organizations like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Association of Universities, which are the top 100 universities in the United States, the National Science Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health are all talking about the relationship of excellence and diversity, not just at the undergraduate level, but at the graduate level and beyond. So I needed to give you all that context. That's the context in which I've been doing my work, and because my view is institutional, the pushback, push and pull up and down that we have gone through in the US and in higher education to try and get to that. And one of the things we found is that diversity programs alone are not enough to guarantee any kind of institutional transformation and sustainability, because when the person is gone, the program is gone. So it's not enough for it to be in the center of the program. It has to be institutionalized. And that institutionalization has to be through like a comprehensive change strategy. And that is what drew me to the University of Sydney. Because you're the only university I know, in terms of my research, that has committed itself to looking at this issue holistically. That is, as an institution, not as just me. You know, most campuses in the US have what we call chief diversity officers, so that it becomes my job to make sure that that happens. And of course, that's not going to happen. It's not going to work. It's very programmatic. So this was interesting and attractive to me to look at how it is done, because you mirror those things in the US, the elite status of the university, the fact that you're putting front and center a strategy that brings in groups of people who have not been represented here, and you're making that the core of what you do and what you value. That is not something you see everywhere. So this process of capacity building, the strategies and the goals that are necessary to do this work, I wanted to document it. So I forgot to tell you, I'm a cultural anthropologist. So I'm in the field. And the field is this institution. And one of the things we do as anthropologists, particularly if we're in a place where we are familiar, or we say we're familiar with what's going on, is we make the familiar unfamiliar. That is, we step back and say, I don't know anything. Let me see what I see. And so the new eyes, the freshness of it. So reaffirming our mission at the Here's where we're similar. UCR, University of California Riverside, and Sydney, we each are very tied to our missions. You guys as the oldest, us as a land grant institution. You know what land grants are in the United States, land grant institutions. These are institutions that were established in the 1860s by the federal government so that every state would have a university whose job it was to create new knowledge and to work with the people in the state to help them further their professions and their learning and what have you. So these are called land grant. Land was granted to each state to have these institutions. So the University of California, the first one was Berkeley, and the second one was Davis, and the third one is our campus. So we're a land grant university, which means our mission is very much tied to, yes, globally, but also very much locally. So that's what that is. And you also are interested in strategic planning, and you also have the push that your graduates would have the skills to live and work in Australia, but also anywhere. And that's everybody, or at least that's my understanding. And that cultural competence is a major priority for this institution as a way to get there. And so I wanted to unpack what this cultural competency means, what is the strategy, and how does doing this make the University of Sydney a distinctly Australian university, right? How does that happen? And how do Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders fit into this? Is this what makes it unique? How is it working? What needs to be done? Those are the kinds of questions that I came to look at. Building institutional capacity, redefining talent to be more inclusive, linking diversity with institutional values means that you have to constantly revisit. I've been interviewing senior administrators here on campus, and that's one of the things that I'm hearing back, is that we had to think of a way to really maintain our distinction in terms of working with inclusion issues. And so making it a part of everybody's responsibility is something people talk about, but actually making it happen is something that is unusual. So one of the ways that we've been pushing in the US to do this, and we've been somewhat successful, is trying to link what we're doing with other core institutional initiatives so that our diversity initiatives are not over here separate, but are a part of what the institution is doing in a broader sense. So the idea of scholarship of engagement, we have very large undergraduate research programs in our university. We've shifted from looking at international relations and international studies to looking at globalization education for our students, because as California sits on the Pacific Rim and faces the rest of the world, even though Washington, D.C. might not be doing so today. And we thought it was really, really important that they would have that kind of orientation. Looking at learning outcomes, which you are doing, looking the same, and doing this in conjunction with national associations. And this has been our strategy in the United States. That is, if you can get your professional organizations to support the work that you're doing, then the universities back home will do that. And one of the national imperatives for us, particularly under the Obama administration, was increasing the number of graduates in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, and making sure that those students were diverse students and inclusive students. And that meant, and this is to my point about you, that meant not just standing and saying, aren't we the best? I mean, we are the University of California, we're the University of Sydney. Aren't you lucky that we've chosen you to come to us? We'll see you in 4 years, right? That strategy was disastrous for us. We had a revolving door with our students, particularly first generation students coming to us. And so the notion of increasing the number of graduates meant we had to turn that research lens on ourselves and say, are we equipped to do this work? Are we organized to do this work? But most importantly, do we have the institutional will to do this work? And that's the other political piece of this. It is highly political, because when you take resources from one place and put them in another, then that means somebody's not going to get those resources unless you have additional resources. And state-funded institutions don't have them, which is why we are encouraged to get external resources or outside grants. So we had to do a reframing of our work for the United States. We had to reframe our work so that it became more central to the way our institution worked than peripheral. And what I see here is a similar kind of strategy. That is, your strategic plan from 2016 to 2020 does that, if you read through it. And I'm not sure how many of you have, but it really does lay out how you're going to do this work. And then the Wingamura Bunga Barabugu strategy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders is really unique, in that it's like, if we are successful with this group of students, if we're intentional about doing it for this group of students, then we have changed who we are. We have changed how we do our work. We have changed how we are impacting Australia, and putting this goal at the center of your institutional change strategy is really, really unique. Now, the question is, how well are you doing? And it's a work in progress, and I'll say that in the very end. But the very fact that you are looking at reviewing governance and standards, teaching and learning, and developing a comprehensive strategy to measure your success means you're serious about it. Because so many diversity strategies and so many universities and colleges in the United States don't measure what they're doing. So it's very easy for them then to get unfunded. When there's a budget cut, what are the first programs to go? The ones that are seen as add-ons, as fluff, as not having any kind of institutional value. And if you have no way of showing what you're doing, then of course that's where the cuts are going to take place. So that is something that I will say that we have hit a wall in the US, which is why I'm looking for a new strategy, a new way of looking at things, a new way of doing things. And this is how it works. You've already said that that cultural competence and the creating of culturally competent people is everybody's responsibility. The question is going to be, how do you do it? How do you make it work? How do you hold people accountable? And how do you deal with people who resist? And I got a couple of questions about that. How do you deal with people who've been here a long time who basically say, I don't want to do this, who are members of the institution? How do you bring them into the mix? So staff, and in the US we say, we separate faculty and staff. We say faculty and then we say staff. But staff is are people who have been the hardest to bring in, but eventually, when we break down those silos and barriers that separate the work that is done on the campus, they become some of the best advocates for this work because they're often on the front lines with the students and meet them first and deal with them every day, and they do it outside of the classroom. And so they have a different kind of view that we can, as an institution, benefit from. We also have a problem in the US with hierarchy. And so with people at the top, administrators, faculty, staff, and then students. What you've seen over the past year or two or three in the US have been a lot of universities and colleges in the press where students have been very unhappy. Students have taken over buildings. Students have blocked highways to the university. Students are unhappy, because they've been invited into institutions like the University of Missouri, where they are told they can have a voice. And then when they raise a voice about issues that concern them, racism and sexism and whatever, the administration basically shuts them down. Then they feel that they have no option but to do that. And what we're finding is that when you invite students into the university, you've got to provide a way for them to have a voice, and you've got to provide a way for them to influence whatever it is you're doing, whether it's governance, faculty, hiring, staff, or curriculum. Because they have a different point of view. And this is where I see the value of those voices, is because if our goal, and that's the Cultural Competence goal, the NCC goal, is new ways of knowing, being, and doing, it has to come from everybody, not just a few people. It has to come this way, and it has to come this way. And in the US, because of the hierarchy and because of the prestige of the universities, the voices of students are not heard. And it's gotten us into a lot of trouble. And at this University of Missouri, for example, and I'm giving this case, but at Duke University, at Harvard University, at Yale University, it's happening everywhere where students are challenging those histories that have excluded them and have not given them a voice in the so-called changes that the institution is trying to make. So I want to learn what's happening here. That can be, hopefully, useful for me with these strategies that are intentional about bringing in and hearing the voices of folks who've been excluded. How am I doing? Okay, great. I want to tell you something, I don't know if you knew, but in California, 10 years ago, it's 2007, actually it's more than like 17 years ago, the state of California passed a law, a referendum, that was a backlash to the changing demographics in our state. And that said, basically, that the University of California, nor any public institution, cannot take race, ethnicity, gender, class into account in doing any admissions, any kind of jobs. And it was a way to shut down, or to try to shut down, that progress that we were making with changing the universities and bringing in new groups of people. We were able at that point to have designated scholarships for different groups of underrepresented people. That all stopped. So, strategy. The strategy became, how do we do what we want to do without being in violation of the law? So the faculty, and this is where it's bottom up, of the University of California, took them 4 years, because you know how we are. We have to get every word right, and passed a resolution saying that while we couldn't do those specific things, we had to value diversity. We valued diversity, and we put that in all of our statements. So the statement was a political statement. The statement was a statement that challenged right-wing groups to come in and insist that we were breaking the law, and that goes on today. So the statement is, the University of California is committed to achieving excellence through diversity in the classroom, research, and the workplace. It strives to establish a climate that welcomes, celebrates, and promotes respect for the contributions of all students and employees. Now, does that sound like it would make anybody upset? Well, it does. So it goes on to talk about it again, linking achievement and excellence, accomplishing the academic mission, broaden and deepen the educational experience and the scholarly environment. And so it's a way of having us stop and think, which we hadn't done before, deeply about our commitment to these issues, so that if we had to go to court, we could say to the judge, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And it was perhaps the wrong reason for doing it, but it ultimately ended up helping us be very clear about what our values were. And coming from faculty this way, it took another 2 years, 1 year for the chancellor of our system, the Teen Campus system, to approve it, and then another 2 years for what we call our Board of Regents. And these are the people that govern the university. So something that started with the faculty is now being used by the entire university and endorsed by the university. And I'll talk a bit more about what the implications are for that on Friday, but it's called Proposition 209, and it tells us what we can't do, and we just ignored them. But there's a cost for that, because we're constantly being monitored. And that was the other thing I'm going to do, is to find out what are some of the strategies that are happening here. So, but what I found out is you don't have a law that basically says you can't do what you do. You can, in fact, target different populations. But I know that there is some pushback of that from particular political parts of your parties, particularly the One Nation Party, that questions why we're doing that. So I want to leave you with 9 points. That is, what are successful diversity frameworks? That things that I have gleaned from being here. One is that it's really, really important to develop a shared and inclusive understanding of what that means. And NCCC is still in the process of refining those definitions, but those are the definitions that everybody will use in terms of that. Creating a welcoming campus climate. It's like, how do you invite people in, whether they're students, staff, or faculty, or administrators, and how do you welcome them? So the various welcoming ceremonies and things that have happened here are an indicator. Now, if that was the only thing you were doing, I would say that's window dressing, right? We do a lot of window dressing in the US because we haven't moved to that next level. Recruiting, retaining, and successfully graduating students. We do a fantastic job of recruiting students, and then we leave them. And then we say, oh my gosh, they just couldn't cut it. When you do exit interviews, you find it's not about the academics, because these are smart kids, right? It's about everything else that's happening on the campus that makes them leave the institution. And so this is what I'm learning that you're doing that is embedded in the institution and not like a set aside. Recruiting, promoting, and retaining a diverse faculty and staff. Women make up 50% of your student body, and international students make up about 20% of your student body. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, from what I can gather, make up about 3% of your student body. And they probably, if you haven't already surveyed them, want to see people in the classrooms that look like them. So how are you doing that? And are you doing that well? And we've started some programs, but it's going to be a long time. If we do it incrementally, it's going to be another 100 years. So we have to participate in disruption of the status quo in order to get us to where we need to be. Otherwise, I won't see it, you won't see it, maybe your grandchildren will see it. Developing and strengthening curriculum that is supportive of diversity goals. And this is also an area where we have some tensions because we are, again, a research university that has hierarchies for ways of knowing, hierarchies for fields of study. And if you're not in the top 4 or 5 of those fields of study that are often in technical schools or science schools or in professional schools, you tend to be sort of seen as service and servicing the rest of those faculty. That's how it is in our institution. I'm talking to the new Associate Deans for Indigenous. I'm talking to the Deputy Vice Chancellor who is responsible for curriculum, and it's a totally different conversation. So I'm learning from there. Diversifying leadership and management, it looks as though you're putting some people in place, or have some people in place who really care about that. Organizing for change, and this is the one that I think the US thinks it has solved. By hiring people like me, they've done their job. Right? By hiring me, it's like, not my job, it's her job to make all this stuff happen. And so this model talks about this is everybody's responsibility, but it also shows how it should happen. And so I've been talking to the Associate Deans for Indigenous and talking to them about their new roles, their brand new roles, and they have some things they're excited about and they have some suggestions for the university. But it just kind of says, if you want something to happen, then you need to organize yourself so that that thing can happen. You can't give it to someone to do it's not their job. And then finally, the research arm is about not just regurgitating the knowledge we have, but what does all this mean when you bring these new ways of thinking, new ways of knowing, new ways of being into the university? How does that strengthen the whole research enterprise? And how do you honor that? And how do you honor the faculty who are doing that work? Because they are often out there and are not doing things business as usual, and sometimes are not respected for that work. But it sounds as at least several of the ones I've talked to said that they see that as their role, is to help bring along the faculty in their colleges, faculty in their fields that have not bought into this yet because they're not quite sure how it works. And then the accountability and reward system. has to be built in, and that's something that several of the universities are doing. So if there is a strong diversity commitment that permeates core values, then recruiting and designing programs comes out of that, not the other way around. And that's something that I think we can learn from. It's driven by what it is you value and what it is you want to achieve, not what you've been doing for the past X number of years and you're used to it and we're just going to continue to do things this way and call it something else. Well, that's not going to work. So diversity exists on both sides of both sides of the Pacific in this case, and our role as leaders is to figure out how to lead this transformation and to keep it tied to our values, right? And again, I go back to institutional will. A lot of institutions that I'm affiliated with know what to do because I do consulting on other campuses in the US, but they don't do it because it's too hard, or they will get in trouble, or people won't like them. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why not. But it's not, if it's everybody's responsibility, then the leadership is both from the top down and the bottom up. And I tell people, and I have to internalize this myself, that a commitment to diversity is a commitment to being in the institutional change process for the long haul. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. This is not something that's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. This is going to be work that is going on after I'm gone, after some of you are gone. But it's a process that's that's worth doing if we're going to do it well, particularly shifting the needle from random acts of diversity in terms of programming to transformational change. It's going to take that sticking to it. And it ultimately is a commitment to making our institutions places where we can not just put it in our preambles to our student learning outcomes that this will be a place that will prepare students to live and work in a pluralistic society in the world. And it means that we're committing to making that a reality. And I've learned a lot about that, but it is still a work in progress. Thank you. Questions, comments?
Yolanda, it's Kylie.
Oh, hi, Kylie. Sorry.
Thank you for your lecture. I think that at the University of Sydney we've made some really substantive progress in the last period of time around the architecture of diversity and inclusion, and that the Wingara Mora strategy has been very effective in that, and that at the same time we've maintained our completion rates for students and increased our student and staff numbers for Aboriginal people, which is fantastic. But I wonder how we get to that next stage of actually embedding that architecture into every day. That I went to a workshop for leaders last week at the University Inclusion. Hi, Donna. Inclusion for leaders in the university, and it was Reconciliation Week, and it was Mabo Day, and we kicked off, and no one did an acknowledgement of country, which was just so. It's that thing where when do these things become that kind of embedded, layered, and what are the things we need to do to get to that next step? Because I think the architecture is working.
Yeah.
What's the next bit and how do we get there?
Well, you mean the architecture is there. So that's a step, right? And I think the work that NCCC is doing is trying to think through how to get people who haven't thought about this to think about it in a way that ties back to the work that they're doing. And actually, when I came here, I was surprised with the welcome to a country, the acknowledgement of country. We don't do that in the US for our Aboriginal folks. And I was thinking, wow, is this authentic in the sense that goes beyond the acknowledgement. That is, have there been some other things that have happened structurally in the country so that this acknowledgement is sort of the icing on the cake of some other kinds of things that have happened. And then, as you say, Reconciliation Week, Mabo and what happened historically, there's a lot of unfinished business still. And there are a lot of people, it's fraught. I mean, there are people that have different views about this and what we should do about this and how it relates to education, how it relates to higher education. You know, there are some people who say, well, the university is not the place to talk about this stuff because it's political and it should be, that's activists and activism. So that's been the tension in the US. But I think it's gonna be a while, and I think the plan is to do both, top down, bottom up. Where do people live? What do they care? What do they care about? What do they value? And I was thinking about past 10 years for us have been in the US hiring more diverse faculty. Because I told you we have the demographics, we have the students. And there are students, particularly in the sciences, students of color, who go 4 years and not ever have a faculty of color. Physics, especially, astrophysics, especially, or a woman of any kind, right? And it's like there are faculty who don't. They say, well, what's the problem here? So it tells you that there's a lot of deep work that has to be done there, and that's where the American Physics Association comes in and the accrediting agencies who have built into their rubrics and their assessments these things. And it's not until that happens that you get the attention of some people who say, well, it's not relevant to me. How is this relevant to what I'm doing or my work? And it's wonderful. I'm glad we're doing it, and I'll go to a ceremony if I can, but I'm not changing. What I'm doing is excellent work, and so that's it. And if it's staff, sometimes our professional staff, they don't have the tools to do it. They don't understand why it's important if it's not told to them, or if they're not given the opportunity to leave their jobs, take time out of their day to come and sit and reflect and think about these things. And that means their supervisors need to say, this is important, and I'm going to find someone to replace you while you go do this work. And for us, that was a snafu. It's like, they can't be gone because we need them here to do X, Y, and Z. Well, who are the students this person is working with? So it's like making that link. This is not separate from what the individual is doing. This is very much tied to the efficiency and the excellence and the knowledge building of this individual in this job, around that issue. Yes, ma'am. Can you say who you are?
Yeah, I'm Shala, so I'm sort of an entity poster in myself. So I'm a woman, I'm an Aboriginal Milleroi woman, and I live with a disability here. But I'm also what we call first in Australia, first generation into university in my cohort of my family. And I'm moved to Sydney University earlier this year as part of the Warringah Leadership Fellowship Program. What I'd say is thank you for talking, because you're saying a lot of things that are in my head and also in my PhD thesis around. I use cultural responsiveness and fuse that with critical race theory in Aboriginal high school education. So that's my area. But I've been through university. I started in university he's showing my age now, 1985 was the first time I went in to university. So it's taken me, that was before the Disability Discrimination Act came into being, so there was no support or anything at that time. But with regards to the Aboriginality side of things, and you're talking my language when you say that it's everybody's business. And acknowledgement and welcome of the country has been a protocol in Aboriginal culture for thousands of generations. Okay, so it is an Australian thing, not necessarily a United States or Canadian or New Zealand thing. They have their own protocols. But it has only probably been the last decade or so that this has started to come into being everyday business. And how that has happened is a lot of agitation over the years. So when we go to events that are major events or major staff meetings where the meeting would just launch off and there was no acknowledgement, then we would interrupt and say, excuse me, can we do an acknowledgement of country? And I would recommend that that happens because it's the only way that it can become everybody's business. I know when I'm in a meeting and acknowledgement happens, I feel it's a safe space, okay? And that's one thing that the institution really needs to be looking at is creating those safe spaces. I only got through my PhD because we created, the Indigenous PhD students, we got together as a cohort and forced each other to complete. Okay, so if you wanted to quit, and all of us did at various times, you had to be accountable to that group. So it's very much a peer community culture. Okay? But it becomes everybody's business, I think. And like one of the things that I saw when I was in Canada at Simon Fraser University is every year when they have an enrolment of students, they have a welcome ceremony for the Indigenous students and bring in the Indigenous staff and bring them into the same space. And there's a drumming ceremony, there's a feast, and there's all sorts. And it's wonderful to be part of that. So there's little steps like that that allow the institution to become not just an inclusive institution, but a safe institution. It's a culturally safe, physically safe, mentally safe institution. And I can hear you're talking about moving in that direction, but you're not using that language of that safety yet.
Yes.
Is that something that you're into?
Well, that's something that the NCCC is definitely into,
Yeah.
and Juanita Sherwood, who is the educational director for the center, is someone who is pushing that very much. And hopefully we'll be seeing more of that in the training and in the work that is being done in the center, because if you invite people in and then business as usual, you've sent them a signal that you don't care about them and their ways of knowing and learning and being, and that you don't want to learn from them.
Yeah.
So it's a two-way kind of street. But thank you for reminding us of that. Yes.
Hi, Yolanda.
Hi.
Mark in Gender and Cultural Studies.
Oh, yes.
So I grew up in the States, and actually I went to UC Irvine.
Oh, you did? One of our rival institutions.
But I have friends at UC Riverside. So
Oh, good. And you have another one.
And I was trained in, I suppose, ethnic studies.
Yes.
Race theory in the US. So it's been a real journey for me coming here and sort of realizing how the language I was talking in the US just didn't translate here or was translated in different ways. So I'm very curious to learn what your observations are. Come here,
You mean here?
Here, yeah.
Yeah.
Or now.
Right. Right.
But I did a really quick question.
Go ahead.
Which had to do with affirmative action. So, with Prop 209 and the backlash in the U.S. since the past 2 years or so, it's been interesting to me thinking about how in the U.S., particularly with the establishment of ethnic studies programs, which are not, it was interesting to listen to you talk about sort of that, you didn't use the word ghettoizing, but the ways in which, right, when we talk about race and cultural difference, these are the people, the individuals in these institutions that deal with it, but it doesn't permeate the entire institution. So I think Sydney University is trying to do that, perhaps within the architecture. I guess what I'm curious about is, in the States, we have a very different legal system, and we had what I think we call positive discrimination here, called affirmative action in the States. I haven't really seen that in my neck of the woods in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences.
You mean here?
Yeah, in terms of hiring practices. Like, I certainly wasn't hired here, for being an Asian American person doing ethnic studies. The job description was very broad. It was for somebody who does Asian studies or American studies, and I was like, dude, I can do both.
Yeah.
And then I realized it's a
You're
completely
too
different
far.
thing. Like,
Yeah.
like Asian American studies just does not exist here in the ways that it does in the States. So, and as far as I know, again, I would love to hear what is happening in the rest of the university, but I haven't seen any kind of talk at all from administration or what we call academic staff hiring faculty in the States around hiring practices where the staff would reflect
Right.
the student body. And I teach a class on race, and it's just amazing how it's brought out so many students of color and white students who are interested in these issues. And I'm like, there's a desire for this,
Right.
but I'm not quite sure what the commitment is in terms of
Well, and folks who've been at NCCC longer than me can maybe speak to this, but I think part of the fact that the center has just been up and going for the past, 3 years? 3 years or so, that this is definitely a part of what they want to do. The question is, and you know this, when you get into the domain of faculty, there's only so much administrators can tell them that they can do. So this is where maybe what we're doing in the States can be helpful, because it's a bottom-up process. It has been a bottom-up process, and it's been in conjunction with the students. So you talk about politics, political. It has been the students that have demanded curriculum that was not in the University of California. And they have said, we want, if you look at, Chronicle of Higher Ed has a summary of, over the last year, the 15 or 20 campuses where students have demanded a real commitment to diversity from the university leadership. At the top of that list are diverse faculty. And because the institutions run on reputation and on student dollars, there is a wedge that they can bring, and they can say things that we can't say. They can do things we can't do, even though we have tenure. But it's like having them as allies. And I think that's something that, as a strategy, you should do, because that's how we got Black studies, that's how we got Chicano studies, that's how we got women's studies, that's how we got all the departments that were not in existence 20 years ago, and pushing to get that information, that knowledge, that scholarship embedded into other departments around the university. So rather than bringing an external consultant, your own faculty in women's studies, in ethnic studies, in indigenous studies can be the knowledge creation place in NCC to create the knowledge that then goes out into these departments. And that's where faculty have a role to play. That's the faculty role with their students.
we're initiating
I mean, you gotta have critical scholarship, because otherwise you don't destabilize the assumptions that have been there forever, right? Yes.
I feel like I should say something because I'm the social inclusion project coordinator for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences.
I think you should say something.
And the project manager of the LINK project, which is an outreach program that we run out of the Department of English. And it's only to say, I suppose, that it's a conversation. It's not necessarily something that has been instituted as a higher goal at this point, or a primary goal at this point, simply because the picture that we're looking at the moment is the question of, so working out of the Department of English, for example, which is my background, where we run our outreach program. The point of the outreach program is recognising that our curriculum and the way the rubrics around our curriculum, the way our curriculum is taught, shaped, everything about it, comes from a white Anglo-middle class tradition that then perpetuates itself, in terms of spreading and reinforcing white Anglo-middle class norms as the sort of benchmarks for success within that as well. really good example of a place to start in terms of a
Where
diverse
you are.
space, right?
Yeah.
Which is part of why we've chosen that. History has a similar program as well. But we're actively trying to make a shift in that space. And just started unfolding our first inclusive teaching suite of initiatives as well, in order to start to make change so that the people that we're training for tomorrow's English teachers are more inclusive in their approach to curriculum, in their approach to the teaching of English, etc. Because we want to make lasting change in terms of that then becoming our faculty here. Does that make sense? And so rather than simply looking elsewhere to bring people in to our departments, for example, though we did finally just make our first non-native English speaker appointment in English for the first time. Like crazily slow.
Right.
Right. But the initiatives are kind of focused around quite long-term change in terms of trying to build those future faculty members, if that makes sense. But I think it is a discussion that's happening, and I think it's a really important question.
Yeah, and again, it's a process, and I don't know in the strategic planning process, because I'm, as I say, flying at 40,000 feet. How is the agenda set from the top, and what kind of wiggle room do you have to say, I understand this is the outcome you want, but this is how we want to do this?
Our program's been running for 6 years, and the position of, so I'm the social project coordinator, which is stepping out from our new coordinator, who's the first time academic appointment was only last year. My role was for 3 years prior to that, so it's brand new for us.
Okay.
To make this an actual core business, shift for us as a faculty, not just taking the lead from the institution.
So to be continued. I mean, it's the work in progress.
Yeah.
Yes, Donna.
Hey, Yolanda. I think the message that you're imparting to us is that we're on the right path, and I think all of your dialogue there has been really, really informing of that we're looking at it from our graduate student perspective, our education perspective, our faculty perspective, and I know the work at the Centre for Cultural Competence, I'm sure you're all doing your Aboriginal Sydney MOOC and all your modules online, which is great. So, Yolanda, I guess my question to you is that knowing this dialogue, the activism that's going on at different levels, what more do you see? The work we're doing is multi-level, as you know.
Right.
Working with the graduate level, working with the undergraduate level, leadership level, and the whole system level. Is there anything that you can support us in to bring it all together? Because there is a lot. And how would you advise us to bring all these different levels together?
Well, first of all, you're defining leadership in a broad way. You're not defining leadership in the traditional hierarchy that, leaders are at the top and everybody else sort of follows. In this model, everybody has a leadership role. So I would say faculty's leadership role would maybe need to be fleshed out, and part of what you all are doing with the leadership program that's coming up is creating communities of practice out of that. So it seems to me there's this logical link between those two things that's about 6 months away, right? In terms of, no, it is good. And that's what I'm saying, when you're starting off, you're taking one step at a time, but the steps you're taking are big, huge steps that are shifting the way things are done. And so it's slower than if you just said, we're going to do this, and then not do it. And so this leadership group that will become communities of practice for people across, and will have faculty engage, seems to be another way to go that's in concert with the more administrative way to go. because they're administrative leaders and faculty leaders. And this has to be that. I mean, it has to come out of the work that faculty do. So I don't think you're on two separate paths. I mean, I see the paths coming together. It's just that you're just not quite there yet to help them create that community for the university. But that's the goal, to do that. At least that's how I understand it. Yes, ma'am. Can you say who you are?
Yes, I'm Melanie Miller from Medicine.
Oh, hi, Melanie from Medicine.
I want to ask something about the student involvement. Last year, there was a big student movement at Sydney Uni for saving the College of the Arts degree and so forth. But that was one of the first movements, I've been here for about 20 years, that happened. And it took a lot of work, and it took a lot of work from people initially, not students at the college, but were students at this campus. And so suggestions as to how we can encourage and empower our students to become more of an active voice in seeking change, in you know, creating a dialogue and not just sitting back and letting it go at its own pace.
Right.
Suggestions?
Yeah, yes. My first week here is called week 0, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
week. Oh, I'm sorry. What? Okay, a week.
Orientation.
One of the things that impressed me, we had a booth out there, was that there was over 300 student organizations. And my question to Amy, because we were out there together, was, do these organizations talk to each other? I mean, are there synergies among the work that they're doing? Because I was going and talking to them, we were going to talk to them about NCCC, and I'm thinking, well, they are doing the same thing that they're doing, the same thing that they're doing, the same thing that they're doing. And it's like, if there was a way to harness that power that's already there with their mission statements and the goals that they have for their groups and their organizations, that is definitely one way to do that. And they could help in many ways. Plus, I don't know about here, but at our institution, they have a lot of money. I mean, they can bring in speakers. They can help to galvanize other students. And so I would see that. I don't know if the medical school per se would have that, but student leaders, and this is another way to get students involved in the leadership part of this. If it's everybody's job, then what is the job of the students who are here to be active participants in this change process? And are we allowing their voices to be heard versus, okay, you do that over there, but we're going to do the real work here, and we're going to make decisions, and we're not really going to take into account the things that you're saying, but maybe we will, maybe we won't. But so that's one thing. And then excuse me, in solidarity with community groups and organizations, NGOs and community groups that have similar goals, right? I mean, it's like they are good allies too, because they have a ear to people that we don't know, and so those have been some of the strategies. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the last point, that was used by the students at the College of the Arts, because student groups had supported the union in other things, and the union people came out, they put up showers for the students, they supported them, they brought their leadership out, and they donated money. And so the students got a couple $1,000. They also commissioned a portrait for the event and paid for that. So that was really good. And I see what you're saying. We, as academics, I think we also need, if it's from the bottom upwards, to encourage student voices.
Yes.
Even if sometimes they aren't listened to keep encouraging them, so that they hear one another, as you're saying, and coordinate and get bigger and,
Yeah, I mean, if there is a governing body of students, they convene, and then I don't know if they have 1 or 2 or 3 meetings with the vice chancellor, or is there a time they meet with the chancellor once or twice a year? I don't know. But it's the disruption, and in the US, it's been protest and disruption because people aren't listening to them, to what they're saying. And so they get frustrated. Yes.
Hi, Yolanda. It's Remy from Education.
Yes.
Just to bring it back to like one foot high, maybe. I was just wondering, in a lot of conversations I've had with colleagues, there seems to be this feeling of being bewildered by the amount of change that's happening in the institution, and a certain fatigue about work and pace of work and so on. And I've spoken to Juanita about this, but you know, the feeling of brittleness when one speaks to a lot of colleagues about trying to change things, that and there's a sensitivity I have to that brittleness as well. I don't want to be the person who's hectoring or just bringing this sort of thing up all the time. And I can see the exhaustion and the kind of, the reaction on people's faces when I bring this sort of thing up. And I wonder if in your work and your experience, how do we work with that? Work with a lot of faculty who may feel, or academic staff or professional staff who may already feel extremely overworked or overburdened or, I guess, change fatigued from various things.
Well, clearly there's not an easy answer for that, but because it does happen in this work. You are often on the front line. You're often the person that gets blowback if something happens, right? Recently, there is a individual on the larger campuses whose job it is to facilitate those kinds of conversations. But if you have it seems to me that some of that heavy lifting has to be done by the senior administrators in the unit. That is the dean, and is someone who has the authority, at least where I come from, if they are on board with this, to make some things happen, like give faculty release time to think about these issues and give staff time to go to workshops. Make it just the way the university is trying to make it central to the value of the institution, make it central to the value of the college or the school, and let that be seen and reward that work in ways that perhaps you didn't. I told you about the faculty at the University of California creating the diversity statement, but they also created 3 policies, one for faculty who are overworked, one for department chairs, and one for deans, where their performance evaluation has built into it ways to evaluate that work so that it counts toward their promotions and tenure. And that was a lot of work. But we were cognizant of the fact that's how people are going to change. Why would they do something extra if nobody in the university cares about it? So it has to be a part of the reward system of the university. So that got the faculty and the line staff. And then we have every year at commencement and other places, we recognize people have gone out of their way, not just with plaques, but we also give them a little money and lots of recognition written up in the newspapers and all that kind of stuff. But getting that work honored in the reward system is what shifted the folks in our university. Because if it's just, wouldn't it be nice if you did this? This is not going to give me 1 more hour. It's take time off this project to do this work. If this work that I'm doing is developing new knowledge in this field of critical research is going to help me, then I will do it. But the problem was, a lot of the people in departments, and I won't say English, because English in the States started this. When the Modern Language Association 20 years ago started this whole thing. But other disciplines would say, we don't know how to evaluate this work. So they would have to bring in external evaluators, but they were willing to do that because they knew they couldn't evaluate the work because that was not how they were educated, but they saw it as work that was important. Okay. Anything else? Is it time?
It's time.
All right.
And I'd just like to thank you very much.
Oh, you're
That was,
welcome.
a fantastic presentation and very rich discussion. And from the NCC point of view, I think we'll all probably agree that it's really good to have a bird's eye view of what we're doing, because we're in the midst of it, and it is a work in progress, and we're all trying to work out how we wriggle,
That's
which
right.
way we wriggle, who we wriggle to, who we wriggle away from. And so it's been fantastic to hear your observations and things that we're all challenged by and give us cause to reflect. Cause to pause and reflect. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.